Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now, let's begin. Drew Carey had learned to survive on 3 hours of sleep. The hospital chair had become his second home, its worn vinyl pressed into a shape that almost fit his frame now. He watched his son Ethan's chest rise and fall in the dim light, the soft beep of monitors marking time in a language Drew had grown fluent in over the past 8 months. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words had lost their power to terrify him through sheer repetition, replaced by a different kind of fear, the quiet, grinding terror of watching his savings evaporate while his son's body fought a war it might not win. Drew had been someone else before this. 5 years ago, he'd walked away from his career as an investigative consultant, the kind of man corporations called when their reputations hung by a thread. He'd been good at finding pressure points, at understanding how people's lies unraveled when you pulled the right thread. He'd retired at 38 after a case that had nearly destroyed his marriage, promising Andrea he'd focus on their family. They'd had 3 good years before Ethan got sick. Now he worked remotely as a freelance researcher, pulling in a fraction of his old income, because someone needed to be at the hospital when Ethan woke up scared in the middle of the night. The door opened softly. Andrea slipped in carrying 2 coffee cups, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. She'd been beautiful when they met. She still was, but now that beauty had been forged into something harder, tempered by the same fires that had reshaped Drew. They'd become a unit, a 2-person army fighting for their son's life. "How is he?" she whispered. "Stable. The new treatment protocol seems to be holding." Drew took the coffee gratefully. Dr. Walsh said if he responds well over the next 3 months, we might be looking at remission. Andrea's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not here, not in front of Ethan, even though he was sleeping. That's good news. It's $26,000 good news. Drew kept his voice neutral, but Andrea's face tightened. They'd already burned through their savings, taken out a second mortgage, maxed out every credit card. The insurance covered the basics, but cancer didn't care about coverage limits. It devoured everything: experimental treatments, specialized medications, the million small necessities that insurance deemed optional. "The fundraiser will help," Andrea said, but her voice carried doubt. Drew had resisted the idea at first. He'd spent his career solving other people's problems, maintaining control, staying invisible. The thought of standing in front of their community with his hand out had felt like a different kind of death. But pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. If humiliation could buy his son another chance at life, Drew would swallow it like medicine. "Your mother called again," he said carefully. "She asked if she should come early to help set up." Andrea's jaw tightened. Jean Moon had been a presence in their marriage since the beginning, a cold weight that pressed down on every family gathering. She'd opposed the wedding, made her disappointment in Andrea's choice abundantly clear. Drew, in her eyes, had been beneath her daughter, a man who worked with his mind instead of inherited wealth, who'd grown up in a modest suburb instead of Jean's carefully curated social circle. "Let her come," Andrea said finally. "We need every connection she has. Her book club alone could." "I know." Drew had already calculated the potential. Jean moved through the upper echelons of their suburban community like a queen, collecting favors and wielding influence with surgical precision. She belonged to the right clubs, sat on the right charity boards, knew everyone worth knowing. If she actually advocated for Ethan, her network could make the difference. "I just hope she actually helps instead of using it as another opportunity to remind everyone that her daughter married down." Andrea's hand found his, squeezing hard. "She's cruel, Drew. She always has been. But even she wouldn't sabotage her own grandson's fundraiser. She's not that heartless." Drew said nothing. In his years of investigating human behavior, he'd learned that people were capable of almost anything when their pride was at stake. Jean Moon's pride was a fortress, and every slight she'd ever perceived, real or imagined, was cataloged behind those walls, waiting for the right moment to be weaponized. The community center's main hall had been transformed. Dozens of photographs of Ethan lined the walls. Ethan at his 5th birthday party, Ethan at his Little League championship, Ethan grinning gap-toothed with his first bicycle. Drew had chosen each image deliberately, creating a narrative of life and promise, a visual argument for why this child deserved to live. Streamers in blue and gold, Ethan's favorite colors, draped from the ceiling. Tables held donation boxes, raffle tickets, and pamphlets explaining acute lymphoblastic leukemia in terms designed to inspire sympathy without overwhelming anyone with medical jargon. Drew stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with a smile that had taken him an hour to manufacture that morning. He dressed carefully, khakis and a button-down, approachable but not desperate, grateful but not broken. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just a fundraiser. It was a performance, and he'd spent his career understanding how to play an audience. Drew, this is wonderful. Molly Kirk from down the street pressed an envelope into his hand, her eyes shining with tears. We're all praying for Ethan. Thank you, Molly. It means everything. Drew had learned the script. Express gratitude, acknowledge their generosity, keep it brief so they didn't feel trapped. He'd positioned himself at the door deliberately, controlling the entry point, making sure everyone felt welcomed and valued the moment they arrived. Across the room, Andrea managed the silent auction table, her smile more genuine than Drew's. She was better at this kind of thing, had always been more naturally warm where Drew was calculating. He watched her laugh with Seth Evans, one of their neighbors who donated a weekend at his lake house. Good. The more people felt connected, the more generous they'd be. The hall filled quickly. Their neighborhood had turned out in force, along with parents from Ethan's school, members of Andrea's yoga studio, even a few of Drew's old colleagues who'd driven from 3 states away. Drew did the math continuously, watching donation envelopes disappear into boxes, calculating totals, measuring their progress against the mountain of debt that never stopped growing. Then Jean Moon arrived. She swept through the entrance with the bearing of visiting royalty, flanked by 2 women from her book club. Jean was 63, but spent a fortune maintaining the illusion of 50. Her blonde hair was professionally highlighted, her clothes expensive but tasteful, her jewelry chosen to whisper wealth rather than shout it. She perfected the art of looking down at people without moving her head. Drew. Her greeting was cool, measured, a queen acknowledging a peasant. I see you've managed to pull together quite a crowd. We're grateful for the support. Drew kept his voice even. Years of dealing with hostile clients had taught him to recognize power plays. Jean wanted him to flinch, to show deference. He gave her nothing but polite neutrality. Where's Andrea? Managing the auction. Drew gestured across the room. She'd love to see you. Jean's eyes swept the hall, cataloging and judging in a single glance. Drew saw her expression shift, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction or disdain. With Jean, the two were often indistinguishable. She brought her checkbook, at least. That was something. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of handshakes and thank yous, of watching Ethan charm everyone from his wheelchair despite his obvious exhaustion, of calculating running totals and trying not to hope too hard. They were doing well, better than Drew had dared to expect. Between the door donations, the silent auction, and several larger contributions from Andrea's family friends, they might actually hit $30,000. It wouldn't solve everything, but would buy them time. Then Jean Moon stood up. She positioned herself at the center table, surrounded by her book club and several of the wealthier attendees. Drew saw her rise, saw her lift her wine glass, when had someone brought in wine, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He was too far away to stop whatever was about to happen. Andrea was across the room, talking to Ethan's teacher. Ethan sat in his wheelchair near the front, tired but smiling, soaking up the attention and love. I'd like to say a few words, Jean announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. As the grandmother of the child, we're all here to support. Drew started moving, but he was navigating through tables and chairs, threading through a crowd that had all turned to face Jean. He saw Andrea's face go pale, saw her start moving too, but Jean was already speaking. I appreciate everyone coming today. I truly do. But I think we need to have an honest conversation. Jean's smile was serene, almost beatific. About enabling. About false hope. About the cruel kindness of prolonging the inevitable. The room went silent. Drew could hear his heartbeat, could feel the air itself seem to thicken. "Ethan is dying," Jean said, her voice carrying perfect clarity. "The doctors know it. His parents know it, even if they won't admit it. And dragging this out, begging for money to fund treatments that won't work, asking all of you to financially burden yourself for a lost cause. It's not compassion. It's selfishness." Drew saw Ethan's face crumble, saw his son, his brave, beautiful, fighting son, hear his grandmother say the words that would echo in his nightmares forever. "Stop begging," Jean said, looking directly at Drew now, her eyes cold and satisfied. "Just let him die. No one cares if he dies." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Drew saw Andrea's face, saw tears streaming down her cheeks, saw Ethan's teacher with her hand over her mouth in shock, saw Seth Evans and Molly Kirk and dozens of their neighbors frozen in horrified disbelief. He saw Jean Moon smile. Drew had spent years learning to control his reactions, to never let his opponents see him break. He deployed that discipline now, reaching deep for the part of himself that had walked into boardrooms and stared down men who destroyed lives for profit. He felt the rage, acknowledged it, and locked it away in a place where it could transform into something useful. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not a broken smile. Something else entirely. The smile of a man who'd just been handed information he could use. "Thank you for coming," Drew said, his voice carrying across the silent room. He kept his eyes on Jean, kept smiling that same cold smile. "It means more than you know." They took Ethan home without counting the donations. Andrea drove, while Drew sat in the back with their son, whose face had gone blank in the way it did when he was processing trauma too large to process. Drew held Ethan's hand and said nothing, because sometimes there were no words that could help, and forcing platitudes into silence was its own kind of cruelty. At home, Andrea put Ethan to bed while Drew stood in their kitchen, methodically making tea neither of them would drink. It was something to do with his hands while his mind worked through what had just happened, cataloging details, building patterns. He'd lived the last 8 months in reactive mode, responding to crisis after crisis, letting events control him. That had just changed. Andrea came downstairs an hour later, her face ravaged by crying. "He asked me if he's going to die, if Grandma Jean was right." Her voice broke. What was I supposed to say? Drew pulled her close, felt her body shake against his. "You told him the truth. That we're fighting for him. That we'll never stop fighting." She destroyed everything. Andrea pulled back, anger replacing despair. 3 months of planning, all those people who wanted to help, and the words failed her. "I know." Drew's voice was quiet, controlled. "Sit down. There's something I need to tell you about your mother." Andrea sank into a chair at the kitchen table, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Drew sat across from her, his hands folded, his mind already organizing information he'd been collecting for years without realizing it. "When I worked as an investigative consultant, I learned something important," Drew began. "People who are cruel in public are usually cruel in private. And people who are cruel in private usually have reasons they're desperate to hide." He paused. "I've been watching your mother for years, Andrea. Not intentionally, not systematically. But I noticed things. Patterns. Contradictions. What are you talking about? Your mother spends approximately $60,000 a year more than your father's pension and investments could possibly generate. She claims to be on the board of 3 different charities, but I've checked, she's never listed in any public records. She has lunch every Tuesday with a man named Jerome Pope, always at the same restaurant, always paying in cash. She takes mysterious weekend trips quarterly, always alone, always to cities where she has no documented friends or family." Andrea's expression shifted from grief to confusion. "You've been investigating my mother?" "No, I've been noticing her. There's a difference." Drew's voice remained calm, factual. "I'm trained to see patterns, Andrea. It's how my brain works. And your mother's pattern doesn't add up. The woman who just humiliated us in front of our entire community, who told our son to die, she's hiding something. Multiple somethings. And if I'm right about what those somethings are..." He let the sentence hang. "Drew, what are you planning?" He met his wife's eyes, and for the first time in months, she saw the man she'd married. The one who'd walked away from his career because he'd gotten too good at destroying people who deserved it. I'm going to give your mother exactly what she gave Ethan tonight. I'm going to take everything from her, and I'm going to make sure she knows exactly why it's happening. Andrea should have stopped him, should have talked him down, reminded him about taking the high road, about being better than his worst instincts. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hand. What do you need me to do? Drew spent the next 3 days being the perfect son-in-law. He called Jean, thanked her for coming to the fundraiser, expressed concern about her health after what must have been a difficult moment. His voice carried nothing but warmth and worry, the kind of manipulation he'd once been paid 6 figures to deploy. Jean accepted his concern with cold satisfaction, clearly believing she'd broken him, that he was groveling for forgiveness or mercy. Let her believe it. Underestimation was a weapon, and Drew was arming himself. At night, after Andrea took over Ethan's bedside vigil, Drew worked. His old laptop hummed in the spare bedroom-turned office. Multiple windows open, each one a thread he was pulling. He still had contact from his consulting days, people who owed him favors or remembered when he'd saved their careers. He called in those debts carefully, precisely, asking for small things that seemed innocuous in isolation. Lance Floyd ran a private investigation firm in the city. He'd been a junior researcher when Drew helped him avoid a lawsuit that would have destroyed his company. I need information on Jean Moon, Drew said without preamble when Lance answered. Financial records, travel history, communications. Everything you can get legally. This about what happened at your son's fundraiser. Lance had heard. Everyone had heard. The video was circulating on social media, 47 seconds of cruelty that had been viewed 17,000 times. Consider done. No charge. I'm paying. Drew's voice was firm. This is business, Lance. I need it airtight, documented, usable. I need to know where her money comes from, where it goes, and what she's doing that she doesn't want anyone to know about. You got it. Give me a week. The second call went to Sean Sullivan, who'd moved from investigative journalism into corporate research. I need you to dig into the Lakewood Women's Charity Board, the Riverside Arts Foundation, and the Metropolitan Community Fund. Specifically, I need to know if Jean Moon actually holds the position she claims. And if she doesn't, then I need to know who she's been telling she does and why. The third call was to Alberta O'Neill, a forensic accountant who specialized in finding money people didn't want found. Drew had helped her sister once, a favor that had cost him nothing, but had meant everything to Alberta's family. I'm sending you what I have on Jean Moon's financials. It's not much, but I think there's something there. Hidden income, unreported assets, something that explains a lifestyle that doesn't match the visible money. You thinking fraud? Alberta's voice carried professional interest. I'm thinking she's been presenting one version of herself to the world while living a different reality. And I'm thinking that gap between the two is where I'll find what I need. While he waited for responses, Drew conducted his own reconnaissance. He'd learned patience in his old career, had once spent 6 months building a case that destroyed a pharmaceutical executive's life in a single afternoon. He had no illusions about rushing this. Jean Moon had spent decades building her carefully curated existence. Dismantling it properly would take time, precision, and an understanding of exactly which pillars to remove so the entire structure collapsed simultaneously. He started with social observation. Jean had a routine as predictable as sunrise, maintained with the kind of rigid discipline that suggested deep insecurity beneath her imperious exterior. Monday morning, yoga at the expensive studio downtown. Tuesday lunch, the mysterious meetings with Jerome Pope. Wednesday afternoon, book club at Alexandra Bennon's house. Thursday, volunteer work at what she claimed was the Riverside Arts Foundation. Friday through Sunday, various social engagements, church on Sunday morning, brunch after with her inner circle. Drew followed her on Tuesday, something he hadn't done since his working days. He felt the old skills returning, the ability to be invisible in plain sight, to watch without being watched. Jean met Jerome Pope at an upscale restaurant called Dominic's. They sat at a corner table, their conversation intense, almost intimate. Pope was in his 50s, well-dressed, with the comfortable confidence of old money. He handed Jean an envelope halfway through lunch. She didn't open it, simply slid it into her purse with practiced casualness. Drew took photographs with a telephoto lens from his car across the street. Pope's face, the envelope exchange, the way Jean's expression shifted from tense to relieved when she secured the envelope. Whatever was in there, it mattered to her. He ran Jerome Pope's name through his contacts. The man came back clean at first glance: wealthy investor, family money, active in several charitable organizations. But buried in the fourth page of results, Drew found an interesting detail. Jerome Pope's wife had died 6 years ago, and Jean Moon had been listed as a beneficiary in a trust fund established by Pope's family, receiving quarterly distributions of $15,000. The pieces started clicking into place. On Thursday, Drew drove to the Riverside Arts Foundation offices downtown. The receptionist was young, friendly, eager to help when Drew explained he was considering a donation in honor of his son. "I know Jean Moon serves on your board," Drew said with a warm smile. "She's spoken so highly of the organization. I'd love to speak with her about how my contribution could be most effective." The receptionist's expression flickered. Just a moment of confusion, quickly masked. "Jean Moon? I'm not familiar with that name on our board. Let me check our directory." She checked. Jean Moon wasn't listed anywhere. Had never been listed. Drew thanked her graciously, made a small donation to maintain his cover, and left with another photograph. This one of the foundation's board listing prominently displayed in the lobby, notably lacking Jean's name. By the end of the week, the picture emerging was devastating. Lance's report arrived first, a detailed breakdown that made Drew's pulse quicken with the recognition of an opponent's weakness finally exposed. Jean Moon wasn't just maintaining an illusion of wealth and social status. She was actively perpetrating fraud on multiple levels, each lie supporting the others in a house of cards that had somehow survived decades through sheer audacity and careful management. The financial records told a story of desperation masked as success. Jean's husband had died 15 years ago, leaving her with a pension that provided approximately $40,000 annually. Comfortable, but not luxurious. Certainly not enough to maintain her lifestyle of expensive lunches, designer clothes, luxury beauty treatments, and generous charitable donations that kept her reputation polished. The additional income came from Jerome Pope, but not from any trust fund or legal arrangement. Pope was paying Jean for silence. 30 years ago, before his marriage, Jerome Pope had a relationship with Jean Moon. When she became pregnant, Pope paid for an abortion and bought Jean's permanent discretion with quarterly payments that had been continuing ever since. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Pope maintained his reputation as a devoted husband to his late wife, and Jean received the income necessary to sustain her social position. But that income still wasn't enough. Jean had supplemented it through a scheme that bordered on genius in its brazenness. She'd spent years telling people she sat on various charity boards, leveraging that false authority to solicit donations. The money never went to the charities. It went into Jean's accounts, carefully structured to avoid triggering any flags, each contribution small enough to escape notice, but collectively substantial. Over the past decade, she'd stolen approximately $400,000 from people who thought they were helping their community. Drew sat back in his chair, reading Alberta's report for the third time. Jean Moon had built her entire life on lies, on manipulation, on taking advantage of people's trust and generosity. She'd positioned herself as a pillar of the community while systematically stealing from that community. She'd judged Drew as beneath her daughter while secretly living far beneath the standards she claimed to represent. And she'd stood in front of Drew's dying son and told him to stop fighting. Drew closed the laptop and allowed himself a moment to feel the rage he'd been controlling, to let it fill him completely before channeling it into something useful. Jean Moon had declared war on his family. She just didn't know yet that she'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent years learning exactly how to destroy people like her. The plan that crystallized in Drew's mind over the next 48 hours was elegant in its simplicity. He wouldn't just expose Jean. He would dismantle her life systematically, using her own lies and the people she deceived as weapons. He would give her multiple chances to salvage something, to show remorse, to be human. And when she failed each test, because Drew knew she would fail, he would take away one more piece of the life she'd stolen. It would be surgical, it would be thorough, and it would be absolutely devastating. He started with Jerome Pope. Drew called Pope on a Monday morning, identifying himself as an investigative consultant working on a matter of potential financial fraud. His voice carried professional courtesy and just enough vague threat to ensure Pope's attention. I have documents suggesting a long-term payment arrangement between yourself and Jean Moon. I wanted to give you the opportunity to provide context before I present my findings to the relevant parties. The silence on the other end stretched for 10 seconds. Then, who hired you? That's confidential. What isn't confidential is 30 years of quarterly payments totaling over $1 million, none of which appear to have any legitimate business or legal basis. Drew let that sink in. Of course, if there's a reasonable explanation, I'm listening. Another silence. What do you want? The truth, Mr. Pope, and your cooperation. I'm investigating Jean Moon's finances because I believe she's been committing charity fraud. Your payments appear to be separate from that, possibly connected to something personal. If you help me understand the payment history and confirm it's unrelated to her criminal activity, I can keep that information out of my official report. Pope was intelligent enough to recognize an escape hatch when one was offered. If I cooperate, this stays confidential. The payments themselves, yes. But I need you to stop them immediately and be willing to provide documentation if legal proceedings emerge from the fraud investigation. Pope agreed. Drew had expected he would. The man had been paying for discretion for 3 decades. He wasn't about to stop prioritizing his reputation now. Within an hour, Drew had signed affidavits explaining the payment history and Pope's immediate termination of all financial support to Jean Moon. Jean wouldn't know about that yet. She'd discover it when her next quarterly payment, due in 2 weeks, failed to arrive. But that was only the first pillar Drew was removing. The second phase required more delicate manipulation. Drew drafted a detailed report outlining Jean's charity fraud, complete with bank records, false solicitations, and a list of every person she deceived. He didn't file it with authorities. Not yet. Instead, he sent anonymous copies to 5 specific people. Alexander Benton, who hosted Jean's book club. Stuart Friedman, president of the Lakewood Country Club where Jean maintained membership. Wendy Gill, chairman of the Riverside Arts Foundation. Gabriel Morton, pastor of Jean's church. And Bruce Andrews, editor of the suburban community newspaper that had always treated Jean as local aristocracy. Each packet included a cover letter written in Drew's most neutral, professional tone. The attached documents detail systematic charity fraud perpetrated by Jean Moon over the past decade. The evidence is conclusive and has been verified by independent forensic accountants. Before this matter is referred to law enforcement, I wanted to ensure that community leaders who may have unwittingly enabled this fraud are aware of the situation and have the opportunity to take appropriate action. This is not yet a legal matter. That status could change based on how the community chooses to respond. Drew sent the packets on a Wednesday, time to arrive on Friday, giving everyone the weekend to process the information, discuss it among themselves, and make decisions before Jean had any opportunity to control the narrative. Then he waited. The explosion began on Saturday morning. Alexander Benton called an emergency meeting of the book club at her house, pointedly not inviting Jean. When Jean showed up anyway, because of course she would, Alexander confronted her on the doorstep. Drew knew this because he'd positioned himself in a coffee shop across the street, watching through the window, documenting everything. Jean's face when Alexandra held up the report was a portrait of shock transforming into rage. Her voice carried across the quiet street. "This is a lie. Who sent you this? Does it matter?" Alexander's voice was cold. Wendy got one too. So did Pastor Morton. So did Stuart. We've all seen the bank records, Jean. We've all seen how much money you've stolen while claiming to represent organizations you were never part of. How you've been lying to us for years. I don't know where this came from, but it's obviously fabricated. Jean's composure was cracking, her carefully maintained facade splintering under pressure. Someone is trying to destroy my reputation. Your reputation destroyed itself. Alexandra's voice carried finality. You're not welcome in my home, Jean, and you're not welcome in the book club. Don't contact any of us again. The door closed. Jean stood on the doorstep for a full minute, visible fury warring with calculation, before turning and walking back to her car with rigid dignity. Phase 3 followed over the next week like dominoes falling. The country club suspended Jean's membership pending an investigation. Pastor Morton asked her to take a leave of absence from church activities. The community newspaper ran a carefully worded article about charity fraud investigations in the area, never naming Jean, but providing enough detail that everyone in their social circle would know exactly who they were discussing. Drew monitored it all from a distance, watching Jean's carefully constructed world collapse. He felt no satisfaction yet, just cold purpose. This wasn't revenge. This was engineering. He was dismantling her life with the same precision she'd used to build it, proving that someone who lived by manipulation could be destroyed by it. Jean tried to fight back. She called Andrea repeatedly, leaving voicemails that started with confused hurt and escalated into rage. Tell your husband I know he's behind this. He can't prove anything. He's trying to destroy me because he's bitter about his pathetic life, because he can't save his son. Andrea listened to one voicemail, then deleted the rest without playing them. She still doesn't get it, she told Drew. She still thinks this is about hurt feelings. She will, Drew said quietly. Soon. The turning point came 13 days after the fundraiser. Jean arrived at Andrea and Drew's house unannounced, pounding on the door with desperate fury. Drew had been expecting this. He'd calculated that it would take approximately 2 weeks for Jean to exhaust all her other options, denials, explanations, manipulations, before finally confronting him directly. He opened the door calmly. Jean looked diminished, her careful grooming starting to fray at the edges. Her hair needed retouching. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the stress lines around her eyes, and her clothes, while still expensive, showed signs of hasty selection. We need to talk, Jean said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Of course. Drew stepped aside, letting her enter. Andrea was upstairs with Ethan, who was having a better day. His treatment was actually working, his latest blood test showing improvement that Dr. Walsh called cautiously encouraging. Drew had made sure they'd be occupied during this conversation. In the living room, Jean didn't sit. She stood in the center of the room like an island, her purse clutched in front of her like a shield. You did this. All of it. The investigation, the reports, turning my friends against me. Did I? Drew's voice was mild, curious. I'm just a father trying to save his son. The son you told to die, in front of a room full of people who came to help him. I was upset. I spoke harshly. You were cruel. Drew's voice didn't rise, but something in his tone made Jean step back. You were deliberately, calculatedly cruel to an 11-year-old child who is fighting for his life. You humiliated my wife. You sabotaged a fundraiser meant to save your grandson. And you did it with a smile, Jean. I saw your face. You enjoyed it. So you destroyed my life? You ruined my reputation over a moment of anger. Drew smiled then, the same cold smile he'd given her at the fundraiser. I didn't destroy anything, Jean. I just showed people what was already there. The fraud, the lies, the years of stealing from people who trusted you. The fake charity positions, the false solicitations. The secret payments from Jerome Pope that you've been using to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't actually afford. None of that was me. That was all you. Jean's face went white. You can't prove. I have signed affidavits from Pope. I have forensic accounting reports. I have bank records showing deposits from people who thought they were donating to charities you don't actually represent. I have photographs of you with Pope, documentation of every lie you've told over the past decade. Drew's voice remained calm, factual, and I haven't given any of it to the police yet. That last word hung in the air. Yet. What do you want? Jean's voice had lost its imperial command, reduced to something smaller, more desperate. I want you to understand something. Drew leaned forward slightly. You stood in front of my son and told him his life wasn't worth fighting for. You told him to die. You told a room full of people who love him that nobody cared if he died. Do you have any idea what that did to him? He asked his mother if you were right. An 11-year-old child asked if his grandmother was right that he should stop fighting. Jean said nothing, but something flickered in her expression. Not quite remorse, but recognition that she'd miscalculated. So yes, Jean, I destroyed your life. I used everything I used to be, every skill I walked away from because I wanted to be a better man, and I pointed it at you like a weapon. Because you hurt my son. Because you try to take away the one thing I will never, ever stop fighting for. Drew's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And I'm not done yet. What else could you possibly do to me? Jean's voice broke on the last word. That depends on you. Drew stood, crossing to a folder on the coffee table. He handed it to Jean. There are two versions of how this ends. In version 1, you make a full public confession. You apologize to Ethan directly, in person, with genuine remorse. You return every dollar you've stolen, work out repayment plans with everyone you've defrauded, and you accept whatever social and legal consequences follow. You do this within the next 48 hours. And if I don't, then I release everything to the district attorney's office. You'll face criminal charges for charity fraud, potentially wire fraud, tax evasion. You'll go to trial, probably be convicted, and spend the rest of your life with a criminal record and whatever money you have left going to legal fees and restitution. Drew paused. But more than that, Jean, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. Every person you've ever known, every organization you've been part of, every social circle you've inhabited. I'll publish a complete accounting of your lies, your thefts, your cruelty. Your name will become synonymous with fraud and manipulation in this community. That's your legacy. Jean's hand shook as she held the folder. You're blackmailing me. No, I'm giving you a choice. You can own what you've done and try to make amends, or you can fight and lose everything. But either way, Jean, you're done hurting my family. Jean left without another word. Drew watched her car disappear down the street, then climbed the stairs to find Andrea and Ethan. His son was awake, propped up in bed with his tablet, watching some cartoon about robots. He looked up when Drew entered, his eyes carrying a question he was too young to have to ask. Is Grandma Jean going to say sorry? Drew sat on the edge of the bed, taking Ethan's small hand in his. I don't know, buddy, but I know this. What she said about you wasn't true. You're not a burden. You're not someone people should give up on. You're the most important thing in the world to me and your mom, and we're never, ever going to stop fighting for you. Ethan nodded, some tension in his small body relaxing. I know. I wish she didn't hate me. She doesn't hate you, Drew said, surprised to find he meant it. I think she hates herself, and it spills out onto everyone around her. But that's her problem, not yours. You focus on getting better, okay? Let me handle Grandma Jean. Jean chose to fight. Drew received her answer not through direct communication, but through a letter from her attorney, threatening legal action for harassment, defamation, and what the lawyer carefully termed malicious interference with her personal relationships. The letter was professionally written, aggressive, and completely ineffective. Jean's lawyer clearly hadn't been shown the actual evidence. He was working from Jean's version of events, which bore no resemblance to reality. Drew had Lance Floyd respond with a courtesy copy of the forensic accounting report and a polite note suggesting Jean's attorney might want to review the materials before proceeding with litigation that would expose his client to criminal prosecution. Jean's lawyer withdrew 3 days later. With that avenue closed, Jean tried a different approach. She began calling mutual friends and family members, presenting herself as the victim of Drew's vindictive campaign. She claimed he'd fabricated evidence, that he was unstable with grief over Ethan's illness, that Andrea was too weak to stand up to her controlling husband. She painted Drew as a villain, using his investigative skills to destroy an innocent woman who'd made one mistake. It might have worked, except Drew had anticipated this too. He'd already provided selected pieces of evidence to several key people in their social circle. Not everything, just enough to inoculate them against Jean's manipulation. When she called Alexander Benton, claiming the bank records were fake, Alexandra had already seen them verified by her own accountant. When she told Pastor Morton that Drew had invented the charity fraud, he'd already confirmed with Wendy Gill at the Arts Foundation that Jean had never been on their board despite years of soliciting donations in their name. Jean's attempts to control the narrative fell apart because Drew had already shaped the narrative before she knew she needed to fight it. This was the advantage of patience, of methodical planning, of understanding that revenge served cold was always more effective than rage served hot. The district attorney's office received Drew's report on a Thursday morning, delivered personally by Lance Floyd with a full documentation package. Drew had structured the information carefully, making the prosecutor's job as easy as possible. The evidence was organized chronologically, cross-referenced, verified by independent experts. The case against Jean Moon was so airtight, it could have been used as a training example. The DA assigned the case to Andrea Patrick, an assistant district attorney known for her aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime. Drew had researched her carefully. She'd grown up working class, had a reputation for disliking entitled defendants who thought wealth exempted them from consequences. She was perfect. Patrick called Drew 2 days after receiving the report. "This is excellent work, Mr. Carey. Almost too excellent. Makes me wonder why you didn't pursue criminal investigation as a career." "I did in a way. I used to be an investigative consultant. I've just been out of practice for a while." Drew kept his voice neutral, professional. "I'm not looking for anything except justice, Ms. Patrick. Jean Moon stole from people who trusted her. She needs to face consequences. She will." Patrick's voice carried grim satisfaction. "I'm filing charges next week. Charity fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion. If convicted, she's looking at 5 to 8 years. Drew felt something shift in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but completion. The mechanism he'd set in motion was now operating under its own momentum, carrying Jean Moon toward consequences she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. "There's one more thing," Drew said carefully. "The fundraiser. What she said to my son. Is that part of the case? Legally? No. Morally? It's why I'm going to make sure this case gets the resources it deserves." Patrick paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Carey, I'm sorry about your son, and I hope he knows there are people who care very much whether he lives." Jean Moon was arrested on a Tuesday morning, taken from her home in handcuffs while 2 news crews filmed from a street. Drew had anonymously tipped off Bruce Andrews at the community newspaper, who then alerted the local news stations. Jean's perp walk made the evening broadcast, her carefully maintained facade completely shattered, replaced by the image of a handcuffed woman being led into a police car while neighbors watched in shock. Drew didn't watch the broadcast. He was at the hospital with Ethan, who was finishing another round of treatment. The boy's latest scans showed continued improvement. The leukemia was in retreat, his body responding to the treatment in ways that made Dr. Walsh cautiously optimistic about long-term remission. They made the fundraiser goal despite Jean's sabotage. The community had rallied after the video went viral, donations pouring in from strangers who'd been moved by the story of a cruel grandmother and a child fighting for his life. They'd raised $73,000, more than double their target. It wouldn't cover everything, but it bought them time, bought Ethan more treatment, bought hope. Andrea found Drew in the hospital cafeteria, her phone in her hand. "My mother was arrested." "I know. Did you?" "I gave the evidence to the DA's office, yes. She chose to fight instead of making amends. This is the consequence." Drew met his wife's eyes, looking for judgment, anger, something that would tell him he'd cross a line. He found only exhaustion and a complicated relief. "She called me from the police station, crying, begging me to help her, to talk to you, to make this stop." Andrea's voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I told her I couldn't, that she'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them." "I'm sorry," Drew said, and meant it. Whatever Jean had done, she was still Andrea's mother. Watching a parent face destruction, even a parent who'd earned it, left scars. "Don't be." Andrea sat down across from him, reaching for his hand. "She told my son to die, Drew. She stood in front of a room full of people and said nobody cared if he died. I know what you did. I know it was calculated and ruthless and probably illegal in several ways. And I'm grateful for it. Does that make me a bad person? It makes you a mother protecting her child. Nothing bad about that. They sat in silence for a long moment, the hospital sounds washing over them. Intercom announcements, distant conversations, the eternal hum of machines keeping people alive. Finally, Andrea spoke again. What happens now? Jean goes to trial. She'll probably take a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence. She'll lose everything. Her house to pay restitution, her reputation, her freedom for at least a few years. The people she stole from will get their money back, eventually. The charities she impersonated will get increased donations from people who want to prove they're not like her. Drew paused, and we focus on Ethan. We take him home, we celebrate every good blood test, we plan for his remission, and we rebuild our lives. Just like that. Just like that. Drew squeezed her hand. Jean doesn't get any more of our time or energy. She's someone else's problem now. The trial happened 3 months later. Jean's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She'd plead guilty to charity fraud and tax evasion in exchange for dropping the wire fraud charges. The sentence was 6 years, with possibility of parole after 4. She'd pay full restitution to everyone she defrauded, plus fines and court costs. Her house sold to cover the debts, leaving her with nothing. Drew attended the sentencing hearing. He sat in the back row, watching Jean stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, her blonde hair now showing gray roots, her face bare of makeup. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by consequence, stripped of the armor of wealth and status that had protected her for so long. The judge asked if she wanted to make a statement. Jean glanced around the courtroom, her eyes finding Drew. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. She'd underestimated him, dismissed him as beneath her, and that miscalculation had destroyed her life. "I'm sorry," Jean said, her voice barely carrying to the back of the courtroom. "I made terrible mistakes. I hurt people who trusted me. I especially hurt my grandson, and for that I have no excuse." It wasn't a real apology. It was words carefully chosen by her lawyer to maximize sympathy and minimize sentence. Drew recognized the manipulation even now, the instinct to control narrative even when standing in ruins. Jean Moon would probably never truly understand what she'd done wrong, never genuinely feel remorse for the pain she'd caused. She'd only understand that she'd been caught and punished. That would have to be enough. As Drew left the courthouse, his phone rang. "Andrea, how'd it go?" 6 years. Probably out in 4 with good behavior. Full restitution. Drew stepped into the sunlight, feeling tension drain from his shoulders that had been there so long he'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. "It's over. Good. Come home. Ethan wants to show you something." Home. Drew drove through familiar streets, watching autumn leaves fall in golden drifts, feeling the weight of the past months finally lifting. He'd done what he'd set out to do. He'd protected his son, shown him that cruelty had consequences, that people who hurt you didn't get to walk away unscathed. He'd been ruthless, calculated, probably crossed ethical lines that would have horrified his younger self. And he'd do it all again without hesitation. At home, Ethan was in the backyard, his color better, his energy returning with every passing week. The leukemia wasn't gone completely. It might never be completely gone, cancer being what it was, but it was in remission. Dr. Walsh using that beautiful word that meant hope, meant future, meant possibility. "Dad," Ethan called out, waving a piece of paper. "Look, my new report card. All A's and B's." Drew swept his son into a careful hug, mindful of the port still in his chest, feeling the small body that had been so fragile growing stronger. "I'm so proud of you, buddy. You worked so hard. Dr. Walsh says if I keep doing this good, I might get to play baseball next spring." Ethan's eyes shone with hope that had been absent 4 months ago. "Real baseball, not just watching. Then you'll play baseball," Drew promised. "Whatever it takes." Andrea joined them in the backyard, the 3 of them standing together in the fading afternoon light. They'd survived, more than survived. They fought through hell and come out the other side bloodied, but whole, changed but not broken. Jean's attempt to destroy them had instead proven exactly how strong they were, how far Drew would go to protect what he loved. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Drew and Andrea sat on their back porch with wine they couldn't really afford but bought anyway, celebrating in small ways. Andrea leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "Do you think we're bad people? For what we did to her?" Drew thought about it, really thought, weighing the question honestly. "I think we're people who had something precious threatened, and we did what we had to do to protect it." Jean made choices. She chose cruelty. She chose fraud. She chose to build her life on lies. "I just revealed what was already there. She'll never forgive you." "I know. I'm okay with that." Drew looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "I'd rather have her hatred and Ethan's health than her approval and my son's grave." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after surviving something terrible together. Inside, Ethan slept peacefully, dreaming of baseball and summer and all the futures he'd almost been denied. Drew had given him that future back, had fought for it with everything he had proven that love backed by determination could move mountains or destroy them entirely. Jean Moon was in prison, her life in ruins, her lies exposed, her cruelty punished. The community that had once elevated her now knew exactly what she was. The people she'd stolen from were being repaid. The charities she'd impersonated were thriving from increased donations. Even Jerome Pope had been forced to confront his past, his comfortable secrets no longer comfortable. Drew had dismantled a predator's life piece by piece, using her own weapons against her, proving that someone who lived by manipulation could die by it. He'd done it methodically, patiently, with surgical precision that left no doubt about the outcome. He'd been ruthless because the situation demanded ruthlessness, because his son's life was worth any cost, because some cruelties deserved consequences delivered in full measure. And now it was over. Drew looked at his wife, at the house where his son slept safely, at the future they'd fought so hard to preserve. He thought about the man he'd been before this, softer, less certain, still believing that being good meant being passive. He'd learned differently. He'd learned that protecting what you love sometimes required becoming something harder, something capable of controlled destruction. He'd learned that revenge, served correctly, wasn't about hatred. It was about justice. It was about proving that actions had consequences, that cruelty would be answered, that the strong who preyed on the weak would eventually face someone stronger. Jean Moon had called him weak, had dismissed him as beneath her, had tried to destroy his family with words designed to kill hope. She'd never known what she was facing, never understood that the quiet man she dismissed had spent years learning exactly how to dismantle people like her. Now she knew, and Drew Carey could finally rest. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Perfect Life. Robert Mitchell had built his empire with calloused hands and an iron will. At 45, he owned the largest construction company in the tri-state area, Mitchell & Sons, employing over 300 workers. His reputation was legendary, fair but ruthless, loyal to those who earned it, and merciless to those who crossed him. Rob had clawed his way up from nothing, working 16-hour days since he was 16, sleeping in his truck between jobs when he couldn't afford rent. The two-story colonial house in Westfield represented everything he'd fought for. Linda, his wife of 18 years, had transformed it into something from a magazine spread. Their son Danny, now 15, had everything Rob never had: private school, college fund, a future handed to him on a silver platter. Rob stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror that Tuesday morning, noting the gray threading through his dark hair. The scars on his knuckles told stories of bar fights and construction accident from his younger days. He'd married Linda when she was 22 and he was 27, a beautiful waitress with dreams bigger than her small hometown could contain. He'd given her those dreams, shaped them into reality with his bare hands. "Coffee's ready," Linda called from downstairs, her voice carrying that warm tone that had first captured his heart at Murphy's Diner all those years ago. Rob found her in the kitchen, still stunning at 40. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, and she wore the silk robe he'd bought her for their anniversary. She smiled, that same smile that had made him believe a roughneck like him could deserve something beautiful. "Early meeting today?" she asked, pouring coffee into his thermos. "Site inspection at the Riverside project. Foundation pour tomorrow if the weather holds." Rob kissed her cheek, breathing in her familiar perfume. "Danny's still asleep? You know teenagers. I'll drive him to school when he surfaces." Rob grabbed his hard hat from the counter. "Dinner at 7? Always." Linda's smile flickered for just a moment. So brief Rob almost missed it. He'd been missing a lot lately, he realized. Late nights at the office, weekend site visits, conference calls that stretched past midnight. Building an empire demanded sacrifice, but lately, he wondered if he'd sacrificed too much. The Riverside project was his masterpiece, a luxury residential complex that would cement Mitchell and Son's reputation for decades. Every detail mattered. Every decision carried weight. As Rob walked the construction site, pointing out adjustments to his foreman, he felt the familiar satisfaction of creation, of building something permanent in a world full of temporary things. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Having lunch with Cheryl today. Home by 4. Love you." Cheryl Brennan, Linda's college friend who'd moved to town 6 months ago. Recently divorced, always dramatic, the type who seemed to collect other people's problems. Rob had never warmed to her, but Linda needed friends. Being married to a man who worked 70 hours a week couldn't be easy. That evening, Rob arrived home to find Linda humming in the kitchen, preparing his favorite meal, beef stew with fresh bread. She seemed unusually cheerful, almost glowing. "Good day," he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "Wonderful. Cheryl and I went to that new spa downtown. Very relaxing." Linda leaned into him, but something felt different. Her posture was too perfect, her voice too bright. Danny appeared in the doorway, earbuds dangling around his neck. "Hey, Dad. How was work?" "Same as always, son." "How was school?" "Fine." Danny's response was clipped, and he avoided eye contact. Teenage attitude, Rob assumed, though something nagged at him. They ate dinner in relative quiet, Linda chattering about her day, while Danny pushed food around his plate. Rob watched his family, noting subtle changes he couldn't quite identify. The way Linda's laugh sounded forced. How Danny kept glancing at his phone. Small things that probably meant nothing. After dinner, Rob retreated to his home office to review blueprints for the next day's pour. Construction was predictable. Follow the plans, use quality materials, maintain safety standards, and everything turned out solid. Unlike people, buildings didn't lie or change their nature overnight. Around 11, Rob headed upstairs to find Linda already in bed, reading one of her romance novels. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, he saw something in her eyes. Guilt? Fear? Then she smiled, and he decided he was imagining things. "Long day," she said, marking her place in the book. "They're all long days." Rob sat on the bed's edge, removing his work boots. "But worth it, are they?" Linda's question caught him off guard. Rob studied her face. "What do you mean?" "Nothing. Just, sometimes I wonder if you're happy, Rob. Really happy." It was an odd question from a woman who lived in a house he'd bought, drove a car he'd paid for, wore jewelry he'd worked overtime to afford. But Rob had learned that women thought differently about such things. "I'm happy when my family's safe and provided for. When I know you and Danny have everything you need." Linda nodded, but her smile seemed sad. "I know you work hard for us. I hope you know how much that means to me." The conversation felt weighted with subtext he couldn't decipher. Rob kissed her goodnight and settled into bed, but sleep came slowly. Something was shifting in his perfect life, like the first crack in a foundation that seemed solid but was slowly giving way to hidden pressures. In the darkness, Linda lay beside him, her breathing too careful to be genuine sleep. Rob stared at the ceiling, his instincts, honed by years of managing difficult people and complex projects, telling him that change was coming. And in his experience, change usually meant trouble. Chapter 2: Shadows and Secrets. Trevor Kane had always been good at reading people. It's what made him successful in sales, and it's what had drawn Linda Mitchell to him like a moth to flame. At 38, Trevor possessed the kind of easy charm that opened doors and loosened purse strings. His silver tongue had sold everything from used cars to timeshares, but his greatest sale had been convincing Linda that she deserved better than a husband who treated her like another piece of property. Trevor's apartment overlooked the harbor, a modest place that he'd furnished with rental furniture and fake artwork. Everything in his life was temporary, disposable, including the women who passed through it. But Linda was different. She represented something permanent, something valuable. She represented Robert Mitchell's money. "He suspects something," Linda said, pacing Trevor's living room in the pale afternoon light. She'd been agitated all week, jumping at shadows, checking her phone obsessively. "Rob's not stupid, baby, but he's predictable." Trevor pulled her close, feeling the tension in her shoulders. 15 years of the same routine, same priorities. Work, work, work. He doesn't see what's right in front of him. Linda had first walked into his car dealership 8 months ago, claiming she wanted to surprise Rob with a new truck for his birthday. Trevor had seen through that lie immediately. She was shopping for attention, not vehicles. The expensive clothes couldn't hide the loneliness in her eyes, the way she lit up when someone actually listened to her talk. It had taken 3 coffee dates before she'd kissed him, 2 weeks before she'd come to his apartment, a month before she'd started talking about how empty her marriage had become, how Rob worked all the time and barely seemed to notice she existed. "I gave him the best years of my life," she'd whispered in Trevor's bed one afternoon. "I was 22 when we met. I had dreams, plans, but Rob needed a wife who'd stay home, look pretty, and never ask for anything more." Trevor had listened and sympathized and slowly planted the seeds of an idea. Linda wasn't just unhappy. She was entitled to compensation for all those lost years. Rob Mitchell was worth millions, and Linda deserved her share. Divorce would be messy, expensive, and Rob would fight it with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to his business. But there were other ways to get what she deserved. "Tell me about your day again," Trevor said, guiding Linda to the couch. "Every detail. I had lunch with Cheryl like we planned. She took pictures of us at the restaurant, made sure to get timestamps on everything. Then we went to the spa. More pictures, more alibis. I was home by 4, just like I texted Rob. And Danny." Linda's face tightened. "He's been quiet lately. Moody. But that's normal for his age, right?" Trevor had been watching Danny Mitchell for weeks, studying the boy's patterns, his vulnerabilities. 15-year-olds were easily manipulated if you knew which buttons to push. Danny was angry at his father's absence, resentful of being ignored, desperate for attention. Trevor had been giving him that attention, slowly building trust. "Kids pick up on tension," Trevor said carefully. "Maybe he senses things aren't right at home." The plan had taken months to develop. Trevor had learned patience in his years of long-con sales tactics. Rob Mitchell was too smart and too careful to fall for anything obvious. But every man had blind spots, and Rob's was his absolute faith in his family. He'd built walls around his business empire, but left his home completely undefended. Phase 1 had been reconnaissance. Trevor had befriended Cheryl Brennan at a bar downtown, discovering she'd been Linda's college roommate. A few expensive dinners and some carefully applied charm had convinced Cheryl to reconnect with her old friend. Cheryl became Trevor's inside source, reporting on Linda's marriage, Rob's schedule, the family's routines. Phase 2 was seduction. Not just Linda. That had been easy, but the entire family structure. Trevor had positioned himself as Linda's confidant, the understanding friend who listened to her problems. Through Cheryl, he'd learned about Danny's struggles at school, his resentment toward his father. Trevor had orchestrated chance meetings with the boy, gradually building a relationship. Phase 3 was the setup. Rob Mitchell's reputation for ruthless business dealings made him enemies. His construction company had contracts with questionable partners, employed workers who'd been in trouble with the law. Trevor had spent weeks cultivating these connections, learning which men held grudges against Rob, which ones could be bought or threatened into cooperation. The video is perfect, Trevor assured Linda. Professional quality, perfect lighting, clear audio. Rob's face is unmistakable. Linda shuddered. I still can't believe you convinced me to help film that. What if someone finds out? Nobody will find out. The location is completely untraceable, and we destroyed all the equipment afterward. As far as anyone knows, Rob committed a felony, and you just happened to discover it. The video had been Trevor's masterstroke. Using deepfake technology and careful staging, they'd created footage showing Rob Mitchell engaged in something that would destroy his reputation and send him to prison. The technical details had cost Trevor 30 grand, money he'd borrowed from very dangerous people. But the investment would pay dividends. Once we confront him with the evidence, he'll have no choice, Trevor continued. Prison or cooperation. He'll sign over power of attorney to you, transfer assets, liquidate investments. We'll be gone before he realizes what happened. Linda pulled away from him. What about Danny? I can't just abandon my son. This was the weak point in Linda's resolve, the maternal instinct that complicated everything. Trevor had prepared for this objection. Danny's 15. In 3 years, he'll be 18 and completely independent. Do you want him to remember his mother as the woman who stayed trapped in a loveless marriage, or the woman who was brave enough to take control of her life? It was manipulation, pure and simple, but Linda needed to believe she was the victim in this scenario. Trevor had learned that people could justify anything if you gave them the right narrative. Besides, Trevor added, once we're established somewhere else, Danny can visit. Maybe even come live with us when he's older. Linda nodded, but Trevor could see the doubt in her eyes. He'd have to be careful. If she wavered now, if maternal guilt overcame her greed, the entire plan would collapse. And Trevor owed too much money to too many dangerous people to walk away empty-handed. That evening, as Linda drove home to her perfect house and her unsuspecting husband, Trevor made a phone call. It's happening tomorrow night, he told the voice on the other end. Make sure Danny's ready to play his part. The voice confirmed understanding and hung up. Trevor poured himself a scotch and stood at his window, looking out at the harbor lights. By this time next week, he'd be on a beach somewhere warm, drinking bitter scotch and planning his next score. Rob Mitchell's empire would crumble. Linda would have her freedom and fortune, and Trevor would disappear into the sunset. The only question was whether Linda would stick to the plan when the moment came. Trevor had learned that people's true nature emerged under pressure. Tomorrow night, he'd discover whether Linda Mitchell was as ruthless as she needed to be, or if her maternal instincts would prove to be everyone's downfall. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. The garage door rumbled shut behind Rob as he pulled into his driveway at 11:30 p.m. The foundation pour had run late. A concrete truck had broken down, forcing them to source replacement material and work into the night. His clothes smelled of diesel and cement dust. His back ached from hours of supervision, but the job was done right. The house was dark except for a single light in the kitchen. Linda would be asleep, and Danny would be in his room with his headphones on, lost in whatever teenagers did on their phones until all hours. Rob grabbed his thermos and hard hat from the passenger seat, looking forward to a hot shower and his own bed. The kitchen light illuminated a note on the counter. Went to bed early. Headache. Love L. Rob frowned. Linda rarely got headaches, and she usually waited up for him no matter how late he worked. Another small thing. Another deviation from the pattern he'd known for 18 years. His instincts prickled again, that same feeling he'd had when a subcontractor tried to slip substandard materials past his inspection. He was halfway up the stairs when he heard it, the sound of muffled crying coming from the garage. Rob backtracked quietly, his construction boots silent on the carpeted steps. Through the window, he could see light filtering under the garage door. Danny was out there, and from the sound of it, the boy was in serious distress. Rob slipped through the kitchen and opened the door connecting the house to the garage. Danny sat on a storage crate, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone screen. Tears streaked his cheeks, and his whole body shook with suppressed sobs. Danny, Rob stepped into the garage, closing the door behind him. Son, what's wrong? Danny looked up, and Rob saw something in his son's eyes he'd never seen before: fear. Raw, primal terror that made Rob's protective instincts surge. "Dad," Danny's voice cracked. "Dad, Mom told me to give you this." Danny's hands trembled as he held out the phone. On the screen, a video was playing. Rob took the device, squinting at the image, and felt his blood turn to ice. The video showed Rob Mitchell, unmistakably him, in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. He was standing over a young woman who was bound and crying, holding what looked like a metal pipe. The camera angle captured his face clearly as he raised the weapon. "Son, I never did that." Rob's voice came out strangled. The video was impossible, insane. He'd never been in that warehouse, never hurt anyone, never. Danny backed away from him, terror transforming his features. "Dad, look at the date on the video." Rob's hand shook as he checked the timestamp. Yesterday. The video was dated yesterday, during the hours he'd supposedly been at the Riverside site, surrounded by workers who could vouch for his presence. "Danny, this is fake. This is impossible. I was at work yesterday, you know that." "I was." "Dad, please." Danny's voice broke completely. "Please don't hurt me." The words hit Rob like a physical blow. His own son, afraid of him, believing he was capable of. Surprise. Rob spun toward the voice. Linda stood in the doorway, but this wasn't the woman who'd made him coffee that morning. Her smile was cold, predatory, nothing like the warm expression he'd fallen in love with 19 years ago. "Daddy's going to jail," Linda continued, her voice sing-song, almost playful. Unless what?" Rob's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The video was fake, it had to be. But the technology, the quality, the timestamp. "Unless you do exactly what I tell you to do." Linda stepped fully into the garage, and Rob noticed she was dressed differently than when he'd left that morning. Black clothes, gloves, like she was preparing for something. "Linda, what the hell is this? What's going on?" "What's going on, Rob, is that you're finally going to pay for 18 years of neglect. 18 years of treating me like a pretty decoration while you built your little empire." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The strange behavior, the fake alibis, the way Danny had been avoiding him. "How long have you been planning this?" "Long enough." A new voice entered the conversation. A man stepped out from behind Rob's workbench, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of practiced smile Rob had seen on 1,000 salesmen. "Rob Mitchell," the man said, extending his hand with mock politeness. "Trevor Kane, I've heard so much about you." Rob ignored the offered handshake. "You're the one behind this." "Behind what?" "I'm just Linda's friend. The friend who's been listening to her for months while you ignored her. The friend who's been giving Danny the attention his father had never bothered with. You son of a—" Rob started toward Trevor, but Linda's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't do that, Rob. Not with Danny watching. Not when that video is already uploaded to a secure server, ready to be sent to the police with a single text message." Rob looked at his son, who was pressed against a garage wall, phone clutched to his chest like a shield. "Danny, you don't believe this. You know I would never. I don't know anything anymore." Danny shouted. "You're never here. You don't talk to me. You don't care about anything except work and money and—" Danny's voice broke again. "Trevor's been more of a father to me these past few months than you ever were." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Rob had worked 16-hour days for this boy, had built an empire to secure his future, had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities Rob had never had. And Danny had chosen a stranger over his own father. "Here's how this works," Trevor said, his voice businesslike. "You're going to sign some documents, transfer certain assets, liquidate some investments, and in return, that video never sees the light of day. And if I refuse?" Linda's smile widened. "Then you'll be in prison within 24 hours, facing charges that will destroy everything you've built. Your company, your reputation, your freedom. Everything." Rob looked around the garage, at his tools, his workbench, the space where he'd taught Danny to change oil and check tire pressure. Memories of better times, when his family had seemed solid and permanent. "You miscalculated," Rob said quietly. "Excuse me." Trevor's confidence wavered slightly. "You think you know me. You think you understand what kind of man I am. Rob's voice was calm, controlled, but something had shifted in his posture. You see a businessman who'll negotiate when cornered. A family man who'll do anything to protect his reputation. Linda and Trevor exchanged glances. Danny pressed further against the wall. You're wrong, Rob continued. I'm not a businessman who happens to work construction. I'm a construction worker who learned business. I'm the kind of man who fought for everything he has, who broke bones and shed blood to build something from nothing. Dad, Danny's voice was small, uncertain. And you, Rob looked directly at his son, chose them over me. Your own father. Rob, don't be dramatic, Linda said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. Just sign the papers, and I built this life with my hands, Rob interrupted. And if it burns down, I'll rebuild it the same way. But first, Rob's smile was nothing like the warm expression his family knew. It was the smile of a man who'd grown up in rough neighborhoods, who'd settled disputes with fists before he'd learned to settle them with lawyers. First, you're all going to learn what happens when you threaten Robert Mitchell. Trevor stepped forward, pulling out his phone. One text message, old man. One text, and your life is over. Send it, Rob said. But understand something. When that video goes public, I'll have nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop 10 degrees. Danny whimpered softly, finally understanding that his father wasn't the broken man they'd expected to find. Linda's hand moved toward Trevor's arm, a warning gesture. But Trevor was too arrogant, too invested in his plan to recognize the shift in power dynamics. His finger hovered over his phone screen, ready to destroy Rob Mitchell's life. He had no idea that Rob Mitchell was about to destroy his. Chapter 4. The Hunter Becomes Prey. Rob stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, his mind shifting into the calculating mode that had built his empire. Every successful construction project began with assessment. Understanding the foundation, identifying weak points, determining which structures could bear weight and which would crumble under pressure. Send the video, Rob repeated, his voice steady. I'm curious to see how far you've thought this through. Trevor's finger hesitated over the phone screen. Something in Rob's tone had clearly unsettled him. You're bluffing. You have too much to lose. Do I? Rob took a step closer, and Trevor instinctively backed up. Let's examine what I actually lose. My reputation? Built it once, I can build it again. My company? I know every competitor in the tri-state area, every foreman worth hiring, every client worth keeping. My money. Rob glanced at Linda. Half of it goes to my cheating wife anyway. Linda's face had gone pale. Rob, you're not thinking clearly. The charges alone will. Will what? Stick. Rob laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You think I survived 30 years in construction without learning how to spot a setup? That video is impressive work. Probably cost you serious money. But you made one critical error. Trevor's confidence was cracking. What error? You assumed I'm the same man I was 18 years ago. The man who worked alone, who had no connections, no resources beyond his own 2 hands. Rob pulled out his own phone, speed dialing a number. You forgot that I'm Robert Mitchell now. The call connected immediately. Rob? Jesus, it's almost midnight. What's? Pete, I need you to listen carefully. Someone just showed me a deep fake video of me committing a felony. Very high quality, professional work. I need to know who in the tri-state area has the equipment and expertise to produce something like that. Detective Pete Romano had been Rob's friend since childhood, back when they'd both been scrapping in the same tough neighborhood. Pete had chosen law enforcement. Rob had chosen construction. But they'd maintained their friendship through 3 decades, bound by shared history and mutual respect. Deepfake? Rob, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? I'll explain later. Right now I need that information. Give me an hour. And Rob, don't do anything stupid until I call you back. Rob ended the call and looked at Trevor, whose face had gone ashen. You see, the beauty of building a successful business is that you collect resources. Contacts. People who owe you favors. People who trust you. You can't prove anything, Trevor said, but his voice lacked conviction. Can't I? Rob smiled. Pete Romano is one of the best detectives in the state. He'll trace that video back to its source within hours. Professional deepfake work requires serious equipment, and there are only a handful of operators in this region. Rob began pacing the garage, his movements predatory. But that's just the beginning. See, once Pete confirms this is fraud, I'll have ground for a lawsuit. Conspiracy, extortion, alienation of affection, intentional infliction of emotional distress. My lawyers will tear through your lives like a tornado. Linda found her voice. Rob, please. We can work this out. We can. Work what out? Rob's gaze fixed on her with surgical precision. 18 years of marriage, and you plan to destroy me over what? Money? Freedom? Or just the thrill of betraying everything we built together? You don't understand what it's been like. Linda's voice rose. Being married to someone who cares more about concrete and steel than. Stop. The single word cut through her protest like a blade. Don't you dare make this about my work. Everything I built, every hour I worked, every sacrifice I made was for this family. For you. For him. Rob's eyes found Danny, who was still pressed against the wall. And you both chose a stranger over me. Trevor was frantically typing on his phone. Rob could see the panic in his movements, the desperate attempt to salvage a plan that was disintegrating by the minute. Were you texting? Rob asked. Your technical support? Your financial backers? Or maybe the dangerous people you borrowed money from to finance this operation? Trevor's head snapped up. How did you know about your debts? Your desperate situation? Your history of long-con sales tactics? Rob's smile was razor sharp. You've been watching my family for months. Did you really think I wouldn't have you investigated the moment I realized something was wrong? The lie came easily, but it hit its target. Trevor's face went white as he processed the implications. That's right, Rob continued. I've known about you for weeks. About your apartment, your debts, your history of targeting wealthy women. About the people you owe money to, very dangerous people who don't accept excuses when payment comes due. Linda looked between Rob and Trevor, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Trevor, what is he talking about? What debts? Trevor's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and visibly flinched. I need to take this. By all means, Rob gestured magnanimously. Don't let me interrupt your business. Trevor stepped toward the corner of the garage, turning his back to the group. His voice was low, urgent, but Rob caught fragments. Need more time? Complications? Payment coming. Rob used the distraction to move closer to Danny. His son was trembling, tears still streaking his face, looking younger than his 15 years. Danny, Rob said quietly. Look at me. The boy's eyes met his father's, and Rob saw the confusion there, the dawning realization that perhaps he'd misjudged the situation entirely. I need you to understand something, Rob continued. That man has been manipulating you, using your feelings against me to serve his own purposes. He doesn't care about you or your mother. You're just tools to him. But he said, he listened to me when you wouldn't. And what did he tell you to do? How did he convince you to betray your own father? Danny's face crumpled. He said you didn't really love us, that you only cared about work. He said if I helped him, you'd finally pay attention to me. The admission hit Rob like a physical blow. His son, desperate for attention, manipulated by a predator who'd identified his vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly. Danny, Rob's voice was gentle now, the anger temporarily set aside. I've made mistakes. I've worked too much, been absent too often. But I love you more than my own life. Everything I've done has been to build something for you, to give you opportunities one never had. I know, Danny whispered. I know that now. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Rob pulled his son into a fierce embrace, feeling the boy's shoulders shake with sobs. Over Danny's head, he watched Trevor finish his phone call. The man's face was grim, desperate. The walls were closing in from multiple directions. Linda stood frozen, watching her family reconcile while her own world crumbled around her. The confident woman who delivered ultimatums 15 minutes ago was gone, replaced by someone who was finally understanding the true scope of her mistake. The video is already uploaded, Trevor said, returning to the group. Even if we wanted to stop this now, who says we want to stop it? Rob released Danny, but kept one hand on his son's shoulder. You see, Trevor, you've been thinking like a small-time con artist. But I think bigger than that. Rob's phone rang. Pete Romano, calling back early. Rob, I found your deepfake artist. Guy named Morrison operates out of a warehouse in the industrial district. Expensive equipment, very skilled, but he's got a gambling problem. Word is he's been taking high-risk jobs to pay off debts. Thanks, Pete. I owe you. Rob, what are you planning? This sounds like justice, Rob said, and ended the call. Trevor's face had gone gray. The warehouse, the equipment, the operator, all the threads of his plan were unraveling in real time. Here's what's going to happen, Rob said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded construction crews and boardrooms for decades. That video gets released, and the investigation begins immediately. Morrison talks to save his own skin. They always do. The money trail leads back to you, Trevor. The conspiracy charges, the extortion, the fraud. It all lands on your head. Linda's involved too, Trevor said desperately. She helped film it. She's part of... Is she? Rob's smile was arctic cold. Because from where I stand, it looks like my wife was manipulated by a predator who targeted her vulnerabilities just like he targeted my sons. A skilled prosecutor could paint her as another victim in your scheme. Linda stared at Rob in shock. After everything she'd done, he was offering her a way out. But that protection comes with conditions, Rob continued. Full cooperation, complete honesty about your involvement. And most importantly, Rob's gaze fixed on Linda with laser intensity. You disappear from my life forever. You sign whatever papers my lawyers put in front of you. You take nothing from this marriage except what I choose to give you, and you never contact me or Danny again. The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and Danny's quiet sniffling. 3 lives hung in the balance, waiting for decisions that would reshape everything. Trevor was the first to break. Linda, we need to talk. Privately. No, Rob said. Whatever you have to say, you say it here. No more secrets, no more schemes. Everything in the open from now on. The trap had been sprung, but not in the way any of them had expected. The hunter had become the prey, and Robert Mitchell was just getting started. Chapter 5. Dismantling the Enemy. Trevor Kane had spent his entire adult life reading people, identifying their pressure points, exploiting their weaknesses. But standing in Rob Mitchell's garage at midnight, watching his carefully constructed plan crumble, he finally understood what it felt like to be outmaneuvered by a superior opponent. Linda, Trevor's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. We need to stick to the plan. The video is already uploaded. The financial transfers are ready. All you need is her signature on documents that will make you rich while she goes to prison, Rob interrupted. Because that's what this was always about, wasn't it, Trevor? The money. Linda looked between the two men, her world tilting on its axis. Trevor? What is he talking about? Rob pulled out his phone again, this time opening a voice recording app. Tell her about the insurance policy, Trevor. The one where if this goes wrong, she takes the fall while you disappear with liquid assets. I don't know what you are. Tell her about the offshore accounts you've been setting up. The exit strategy that involves her facing federal charges while you sip cocktails on a beach somewhere. Rob's voice was calm, matter of fact. Tell her how you've been playing the long game. Not just on me, but on her too. The look on Linda's face was heartbreaking. The expression of someone watching their last refuge crumble. Trevor, is that true? Trevor's practiced charm finally abandoned him completely. Linda, you have to understand the risk management required. Risk management? Linda's voice rose to a shriek. You bastard. You were planning to abandon me. Like you planned to abandon your family, Rob observed quietly. Funny how betrayal travels in circles. Danny had been silent during this exchange, still pressed against his father's side, but now he spoke up. Mom, why did you do this? Why did you want to hurt Dad? Linda's attention shifted to her son, and Rob saw something break in her expression. Whatever anger had driven her to this point, whatever justification she'd built in her mind, they crumbled under her child's questioning gaze. I thought, Linda's voice faltered. I thought he didn't love us anymore. I thought he cared more about his work than his family. So you decided to destroy him, Danny said, and the condemnation in his young voice was absolute. You decided to send him to prison. Danny, you don't understand how complicated. I understand that you're my mother, and you try to destroy my father. Danny pulled away from Rob and faced Linda directly. Trevor told me it was just about getting Dad's attention, making him realize what he was losing. He never said anything about prison or destroying his life. Rob felt a surge of pride at his son's moral clarity, even as his heart broke for the boy's pain. To discover that one parent had been willing to sacrifice the other for personal gain. No child should have to process that kind of betrayal. Trevor was backing toward the garage door, clearly calculating his chances of escape. But Rob had anticipated this. I wouldn't, Rob said conversationally. Pete Romano has units positioned around the neighborhood. They've been there since I called him. It was another bluff, but Trevor couldn't know that. His shoulders sagged in defeat. Here's what's going to happen, Rob continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to giving orders that weren't questioned. Trevor, you're going to call Morrison and tell him to destroy all evidence of the video project. Then you're going to transfer any assets you've already moved back to their original accounts. I can't. The people I owe money to are going to be disappointed. That's what happens when you gamble with money you don't have. Rob's tone was unsympathetic. You chose to target my family to solve your problems. Now you get to face the consequences. Rob turned to Linda, and you're going to choose. Right now, in front of our son, you can cooperate fully, help me destroy every trace of this conspiracy, and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else. Or you can stand by Trevor, face federal charges for extortion and fraud, and spend the next decade in prison. Linda looked at Trevor, searching his face for some sign that he had a solution, a backup plan, anything that would salvage this disaster. But Trevor's expression was that of a man watching his own execution. What about Danny? Linda asked finally. What about him? Rob's voice was ice cold. You made your choice when you decided to use him against me. You forfeited your right to maternal concern the moment you turned my son into a weapon. Dad, Danny said quietly. Can I talk to Mom? Alone. Rob hesitated. After everything that had happened, the idea of leaving Linda alone with Danny felt dangerous. But his son had been through enough trauma for one night. If this conversation would help him process what had happened, Rob could allow it. 5 minutes, Rob said. Trevor and I will step outside. Rob gestured for Trevor to precede him out of the garage. The night air was cool and clean, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. Rob could hear Danny's voice through the thin walls, too low to make out words, but carrying the tone of someone working through profound disappointment. You really think you've won, Trevor said, leaning against Rob's truck. But this isn't over. There are people involved in this that you don't know about, people who won't just walk away because your plan fell apart. The people you owe money to? Rob studied Trevor's face in the dim streetlight. The ones who fronted you cash for the deepfake operation? Tell me about them. Trevor's laugh was bitter. You think you're tough because you built a construction company? These people break kneecaps for entertainment. They don't care about your reputation or your connections. They want their money, and they're going to get it one way or another. From me, you mean. Since your original plan failed. From someone. And Linda's still legally your wife, which makes her responsible for community debts. The threat was clear, and Rob felt his anger shift into something colder, more focused. It was one thing to target him directly. Threatening Linda, despite her betrayal, was another matter entirely. How much? Rob asked. 80 grand plus interest. They're not the patient type. Rob did quick calculations. 80,000 was significant, but manageable, especially if it eliminated an ongoing threat. But paying Trevor's debts felt like rewarding failure, encouraging future attacks. Here's a better idea, Rob said. You're going to make some phone calls. You're going to explain to these dangerous friends of yours that the job failed, the target proved too difficult, and they need to write off the loss. They don't write off losses. They collect them in blood. Not if you give them something better. Rob's smile was predatory. You see, Trevor, you're not the only one with dangerous connections. The difference is mine are legal. Rob pulled out his phone and showed Trevor a contact list that included judges, prosecutors, federal agents, and police commissioners. 30 years of successful business builds a lot of relationships. My lawyer plays golf with the district attorney. My accountant is married to a federal judge. My best friend from childhood runs the organized crime task force. Trevor's face went white as he processed the implications. So here's what you're going to do, Rob continued. You're going to convince your creditors that pursuing this debt would expose them to federal investigation. You're going to make them understand that Robert Mitchell is not a target. He's a trap. The garage door opened, and Danny emerged, his face streaked with tears, but his posture more settled. Linda followed, looking like a woman who'd just attended her own funeral. We talked, Danny said simply. I understand why she did it, but I can't forgive it. She's my mother, but she chose to hurt our family. That's not something I can just forget. Rob felt his heart break for his son's lost innocence. 15 years old, and already learning that the people you trust most can be the ones who hurt you deepest. Linda, Rob asked, what's your decision? Linda's voice was barely a whisper. I'll cooperate. I'll sign whatever you want to sign. Just, please don't completely destroy me. I know I don't deserve mercy, but you'll get what you deserve, Rob said. Nothing more, nothing less. He looked at Trevor, who was staring at his phone like it might explode. And you're going to start making those calls. Right now. Because every minute you delay makes this situation worse for everyone involved. Trevor nodded slowly, finally understanding that his only path to survival ran through Robert Mitchell's mercy. And mercy, Rob had learned that night, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The conspiracy was unraveling. The conspirators were broken, but Rob's real work was just beginning. Destroying his enemies had been the easy part. Rebuilding his family's trust, healing his son's wounds, and constructing a new life from the wreckage of the old one. That would require all the skills that had built his empire, and some he was only just beginning to discover. Chapter 6, The Price of Betrayal. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and careful orchestration. Rob had transformed his home office into a war room, coordinating multiple simultaneous operations with the precision that had made Mitchell & Sons the most successful construction company in the region. Linda sat at the kitchen table, signing document after document under the watchful eye of Rob's attorney, Margaret Shun, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in high-stakes divorce proceedings. Each signature stripped away another piece of the life Linda had known, reducing 18 years of marriage to legal boilerplate and financial settlements. This transfers your interest in the Westfield property to your husband, Margaret explained, sliding another form across the table. You'll retain ownership of the downtown condo, the Lexus, and a settlement of $200,000. Linda's hand trembled as she signed. $200,000 sounded generous until you considered she was walking away from a marriage worth several million. But generosity wasn't the point. Control was. Rob was demonstrating that he held all the power now, that her cooperation was rewarded, but her betrayal came with consequences. Trevor had spent those same 48 hours making increasingly desperate phone calls. Rob could hear fragments of conversation through the thin walls of the guest room where Trevor was confined. Explanations, pleas, promises that sounded less convincing with each iteration. The Kozlov organization isn't known for patience. Detective Pete Romano had explained when Rob called for background on Trevor's creditors. Russian mob, mostly loan sharking and protection rackets. They've got legitimate business fronts, but their collection methods are definitely old school. How old school? Hospital old school. Sometimes morgue old school. Rob had factored this information into his planning. The Kozlovs represented an ongoing threat that needed to be neutralized permanently, not temporarily. You couldn't negotiate with people like that. You could only eliminate them or redirect their attention elsewhere. Danny had returned to school, though Rob could see the strain in his son's face. The boy was processing trauma that no 15-year-old should have to handle, learning lessons about trust and betrayal that would shape his character for the rest of his life. Rob had arranged for counseling, but some wounds could only heal with time. The video has been completely destroyed, Trevor reported on the second day, his voice hoarse from stress and sleepless nights. Morrison wiped his servers and destroyed the hardware. There's no trace of it anywhere. Good, Rob said. Now tell me about the Kozlovs. Trevor's face went ashen. What about them? Their business model, their operations, their weaknesses. Everything you know. Rob, you don't understand. These aren't people you can intimidate or outsmart. They're businessmen, Rob interrupted. Violent businessmen, but businessmen nonetheless. They respond to profit and loss like everyone else. The question is how to make your debt more expensive to collect than it's worth. Rob had been researching the Kozlov organization since Pete first mentioned them. They operated several legitimate businesses, a trucking company, 2 restaurants, a construction supply warehouse. The construction connection was interesting. Rob had never dealt with them directly, but he knew their reputation in the industry. Alexei Kozlov, Rob mused, reading from a file on his desk, owns Kozlov Materials, supplies concrete and steel to half the contractors in the city, including some of my competitors. Trevor looked confused. What does that have to do with? Everything. Rob's smile was sharp. See, Trevor, you're thinking like a small-time criminal, but I think like a businessman. And in business, leverage is everything. Rob picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized hours earlier. The call was answered on the second ring by a heavily accented voice. Kozlov Materials. This is Alexei. Mr. Kozlov, this is Robert Mitchell of Mitchell & Sons Construction. I understand we have a mutual acquaintance who's created some complications. There was a pause, the sound of calculation. Mr. Mitchell, your reputation precedes you. What complications? Trevor Kane owes you money. Money he borrowed to finance an operation against my family. That operation has failed, and Mr. Kane is now under my protection. Another pause, longer this time. Protection is expensive, Mr. Mitchell. $80,000 expensive. I'm not calling to pay his debt. I'm calling to offer you something more valuable than money. I'm listening. Exclusive supplier status for the Riverside project. $12 million in concrete and steel, with guaranteed payment schedules and completion bonuses, plus preferential consideration for all future Mitchell & Sons projects. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Rob could practically hear Alexei's mental calculations. 80,000 in questionable debt versus millions in legitimate business. This is contingent on Mr. Kane's debt being forgiven. Completely forgiven. Clean slate. And if Mr. Kane attempts similar operations in the future, then he becomes your problem again. But until then, he's off limits. Acceptable. I will prepare the contracts. Rob ended the call and looked at Trevor, who was staring at him in amazement. Why did you do that? Rob finished. Because smart enemies are more dangerous than smart allies. You've seen what I'm capable of when threatened. Would you rather have me as a partner or an adversary? Trevor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. What do you want from me? Information. Names. Details about everyone involved in this conspiracy. I want to know who else might come after my family, who else might think we're easy targets. And in return, you get to live. You get to start over somewhere else with a clean slate. But you disappear, Trevor, permanently. If I ever see you within 100 miles of my family again, the Kozlovs will be the least of your problems. Trevor spent the next hour detailing every aspect of the conspiracy, every person involved, every loose end that might cause future problems. Rob recorded everything, building a comprehensive picture of the threat landscape around his family. By Thursday evening, the immediate crisis was resolved. Linda had signed the final papers and would be moving to the downtown condo within the week. Trevor had a bus ticket to Portland and enough cash to start over somewhere the Kozlovs would never find him. The legal complications were settled, the financial arrangements finalized. But Rob knew this was just the beginning. The attack on his family had exposed vulnerabilities he'd never considered, blind spots in his defenses that needed to be addressed. More importantly, it had shown him something about himself, something cold and calculating that he'd kept buried under years of legitimate business success. That evening, Rob found Danny in his room, homework spread across his desk, but clearly struggling to concentrate. "How are you holding up, son?" Danny looked up, and Rob saw the same steely determination in his son's eyes that he recognized in his own mirror. "I'm angry, Dad. Really angry. At me? For how I handled this? No, at myself. For being so stupid, for letting them use me against you." Danny's voice was tight with self-recrimination. "I should have seen through it. I should have known better." Rob sat on the edge of the bed. "You're 15, Danny. You're supposed to trust people, supposed to believe that adults have your best interests at heart. What happened wasn't your fault, but I chose them over you. Even when you tried to tell me the truth, I believed them instead. And what have you learned from that?" Danny considered the question seriously. That trust has to be earned. That people can lie even when they claim to love you. That sometimes the people closest to you are the most dangerous. Rob felt a chill at his son's words. They were true, but they were also the kind of hard lessons that could turn a person cynical, cold, isolated. The kind of lessons that had shaped Rob's own character in his youth. "Those are important lessons," Rob said carefully. "But don't let them make you hard, Danny. Don't let what happened here turn you into someone who can't love or trust anyone." "How do you do it, Dad? How do you trust anyone after something like this?" Rob was quiet for a long moment, searching for an answer that would serve his son well. "You trust carefully. You verify before you believe. And you never, ever forget that some betrayals are unforgivable." Danny nodded, processing this wisdom with the seriousness of someone who'd learned adult lessons the hard way. "Dad, what's going to happen to Mom? She's going to live with the choices she made. Some consequences can't be negotiated away or bought off. She betrayed her family, and that's not something you recover from. Do you think she's sorry?" Rob considered the question. Linda had cried during the final document signing, had begged for forgiveness, had promised it would never happen again. But remorse and genuine change were different things entirely. "I think she's sorry she got caught," Rob said finally. "I think she's sorry her plan failed. Whether she's actually sorry for what she did, that's something only she can answer." Danny returned his homework, and Rob headed downstairs to his office. He had calls to make, plans to finalize, a new security structure to implement around his family. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Rob Mitchell had learned something important about himself during this crisis. He was capable of things he'd never imagined. Cold things, ruthless things, and that capability would serve him well in the battles that were surely coming. Because men like Robert Mitchell didn't just have enemies, they created them. And the price of betrayal, Rob had decided, was something he would collect in full from anyone foolish enough to threaten his family again. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 6 months after the garage confrontation, Rob stood in his office reviewing the quarterly reports that confirmed what he already knew. Mitchell & Sons was experiencing unprecedented growth. The exclusive contract with Kozlov Materials had opened doors to larger projects, government contracts, and partnerships that would have taken years to develop through conventional channels. But success in business was only part of Rob's transformation. The man who had once trusted implicitly now verified everything. The father who had once worked long hours to provide for his family now understood that presence was more valuable than provision. The husband who had once believed in the permanence of marriage now lived alone in a house that had been purged of every trace of Linda's existence. Danny had adapted to their new reality with resilience that both impressed and worried Rob. The boy was thriving academically, excelling in sports, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. At 16, Danny had learned lessons about betrayal and consequence that most people didn't master until middle age. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you," Danny said one evening over dinner. They ate together every night now, a ritual Rob had instituted to rebuild the connection that had been damaged by years of work-focused absence. "What's on your mind, son?" "I've been getting messages. From Mom." Rob set down his fork carefully. Linda's contact with Danny was explicitly forbidden under the separation agreement, a violation that could result in legal consequences. "What kind of messages?" "Texts mostly, sometimes emails. She wants to see me, to explain her side of what happened. She says you're keeping us apart unfairly." Rob studied his son's face, noting the tension there. "What do you think about that?" "I think she had her chance to explain. In the garage that night, when everything came out, she chose Trevor over us. chose money over family. I don't see what else there is to discuss. The cold logic in Danny's voice was startling. Rob recognized his own analytical nature reflected in his son, but worried about the emotional cost of such detachment. Danny, she's still your mother. Despite everything that happened, despite the choices she made, that biological connection doesn't mean anything, Danny interrupted. Biology doesn't create obligation. Love and loyalty have to be earned, just like respect. She forfeited her right to be my mother when she tried to destroy my father. Rob felt a mixture of pride and concern at his son's moral clarity. The boy had developed an ethical framework that was admirably consistent, but potentially limiting. Learning to never forgive meant never being vulnerable, but it also meant never experiencing the full range of human connection. Have you responded to her messages? Once. I told her that any contact needed to go through you, that I wasn't interested in secret communication. She hasn't respected that boundary. Rob made a mental note to have his lawyer send Linda another cease and desist letter. Testing boundaries was typical behavior for someone who'd lost control and was looking for any avenue back into the lives she'd abandoned. There's something else, Danny continued. I've been doing some research on Trevor. What kind of research? Social media, public records, business registrations. I wanted to know what happened to him after he left town. Rob had been wondering the same thing, but hadn't actively investigated. Trevor Kane's fate was less important than ensuring he stayed gone, but curiosity was natural. What did you find? He's in Portland, like you suggested, working a used car lot, living in a studio apartment. Completely different life than what he had here. Danny paused. He looks broken. Good, Rob said without hesitation. Actions have consequences. He chose to target our family, and now he's living with the results of that choice. Do you think he learned his lesson? Rob considered the question. Men like Trevor Kane were fundamentally opportunistic, always looking for angles, always calculating risk versus reward. The question wasn't whether he'd learned a lesson. It was whether he'd learned the right lesson. He learned that I'm not an easy target, Rob said finally. Whether he learned not to target anyone is a different question entirely. That weekend, Rob received a call that confirmed his instincts about unfinished business. Pete Romano's voice was tense with professional concern. Rob, we need to talk. In person. How soon can you get to my office? An hour later, Rob sat across from his childhood friend in the detective's cramped office, studying crime scene photos that made his blood run cold. Alexei Kozlov was found dead in his office 3 days ago. Pete explained. Professional hit, very clean, very thorough. The kind of work that costs serious money. Rob stared at the photos, his mind racing through implications. Any suspects? Competing organizations, mostly. The Kozlovs have been expanding their territory, stepping on toes. But there's something else. Pete leaned forward. Alexei had been asking questions about you. About your business, your family, your relationship with Trevor Kane. When, starting about 2 weeks ago, he was being very careful, very discreet, but word gets around in my business. Rob processed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone hired Alexei to investigate me, then killed him to cover their tracks. That's my working theory. The question is who and why now, 6 months after the Trevor Kane situation was resolved. Rob thought about Linda's messages to Danny, about boundary testing and probing for weaknesses. Pete, I need you to look into something for me. Linda's been trying to contact Danny against court orders. I want to know if she's working alone or if someone's encouraging that contact. You think she's involved in this? I think someone is cleaning up loose ends. Alexei knew about Trevor's debt, about the deal we made to resolve it. If someone wanted to eliminate all traces of that arrangement. Pete nodded grimly. They need to silence everyone involved. Trevor, Linda, Alexei, potentially you and Danny. The scope of the threat was becoming clear. This wasn't random violence or competitive business practices. This was a systematic elimination of witnesses to the events 6 months ago. Someone was preparing for something that required complete secrecy. I need protection for Danny, Rob said. Whatever this is, whoever's behind it, they're thinking long-term and they're thinking thoroughly. Already arranged. Patrol units will be monitoring your house and Danny's school. But Rob, Pete's expression was serious. You need to consider the possibility that you're not just a target. You might be the primary target. Rob had been thinking the same thing. The attack on his family 6 months ago had been personal, driven by greed and desperation. This felt different, professional, calculated, methodical. The kind of operation that required resources and planning. Who benefits from my death? Rob asked aloud. Besides Linda? Your business competitors, anyone who owes you money, anyone who's been on the wrong side of your deals over the years. Pete consulted his notes. You made enemies, Rob. Successful men always do. But even as Pete spoke, Rob was thinking deeper, looking for connections that went beyond simple business rivalry. The timing was wrong for coincidence. 6 months after the Trevor Kane crisis, just as his business was reaching new heights of success, just as his relationship with Danny was stronger than ever, someone wanted to tear it all down. Pete, I need you to dig into Linda's finances since the separation. See if she's been receiving money from unknown sources, if anyone's been supporting her lifestyle. You think she's being bankrolled? I think she's being used. Again, and this time, the people using her are much more dangerous than Trevor Kane ever was. Rob left the police station with a clear understanding of his situation. The attack on his family 6 months ago hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been phase one of a longer campaign. Someone with resources and patience was systematically targeting the Mitchell family, and they'd been planning this operation for months. But if his enemies thought Robert Mitchell would be easier to eliminate than he'd been to intimidate, they were about to learn the same lesson Trevor Kane had learned. Rob had built his empire by being smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than his competitors. Now he would defend it the same way. The war for his family's survival was just beginning, and Rob intended to win it decisively. Because the price of losing wasn't just his life or his business. It was his son's future, and that was something Robert Mitchell would never allow anyone to threaten. Chapter 8, Blood and Steel. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, professional and swift. Rob's security system detected the breach at 5:47 a.m. 3 vehicles, 8 men, military precision. But Robert Mitchell hadn't survived 30 years in construction by being unprepared for dangerous situations. The safe room he'd built in the basement could withstand a direct assault for hours. Danny was there in 30 seconds, confused but trusting his father's emergency protocols. Rob activated the silent alarm, connecting directly to Pete Romano's private line, then armed himself with weapons he'd hoped never to use. Dad, what's happening? Danny's voice was steady despite the circumstances, a testament to the emotional resilience he'd developed since his mother's betrayal. Someone's trying to finish what they started 6 months ago, Rob replied, checking the monitor feed from cameras positioned around the property. Professional team, military equipment. This isn't random. Through the basement speakers, they could hear footsteps above, systematic searching, the sound of furniture being overturned. The intruders were being thorough, looking for something specific. Rob's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. We have Linda. Trade yourself for her location. You have 10 minutes. The tactical situation crystallized instantly. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a hostage crisis designed to force Rob into an impossible choice. Save the woman who'd betrayed him, or let her die knowing he could have prevented it. Danny, listen to me very carefully, Rob said, pulling his son away from the monitors. I need you to stay in this room, no matter what happens upstairs. There's a secondary exit through the tunnel that leads to the neighbor's basement. If anything happens to me, you use that route and get to Pete Romano. Dad, you're not going up there. This is obviously a trap. Of course it's a trap, but it's also an opportunity. Rob smiled grimly. They think they know Robert Mitchell, the businessman, the family man, the legitimate contractor. They don't know the man I was before I built all this. Rob had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant violence, where disputes were settled with fists and sometimes worse. Those skills have been dormant for decades, buried under suits and contracts and legitimate success. But they'd never disappeared entirely. The house's intercom crackled with an unfamiliar voice. Mr. Mitchell, we know you're here. This doesn't have to be complicated. Come upstairs, and we could discuss terms like civilized people. Rob keyed the intercom response. Send me proof that Linda's alive, then we'll talk. Proof is expensive, Mr. Mitchell. But I suppose we can afford a small investment. A phone buzzed with an incoming video call. Linda's face appeared on screen, terror-stricken but apparently unharmed. She was in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by armed men. Rob. Her voice was barely a whisper. They said to let me go if you. The video cut off, replaced by text. Ground floor. Alone. 5 minutes. Rob made his choice with the cold calculation that had built his empire. Linda's fate was her own responsibility. She'd chosen to involve herself with dangerous people, chosen to betray her family, chosen the path that led to this moment. But Danny's safety was non-negotiable. Son, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens next, whatever you see or hear, remember that everything I do is to protect you. Everything. Danny's eyes widened as he processed his father's tone. Dad, you're scaring me. Good. Fear keeps you alive. Stay in this room. Use the tunnel if necessary. Trust only Pete Romano. Rob kissed his son's forehead. I love you, Danny. Remember that. Rob armed himself with tools from his construction days. Weapons that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, but could be devastatingly effective in experienced hands. He'd learned violence in back alleys and bar fights. Refined it during years when solving problems with physical force was simply another business tool. The man waiting in Rob's living room was exactly what he'd expected. Military bearing, expensive clothes, the kind of professional competence that costs serious money. 2 associates flanked him, similarly equipped and positioned. Mr. Mitchell, thank you for being reasonable. Let's skip the pleasantries. Who are you and what do you want? My name is irrelevant. What I want is simple. The complete destruction of evidence from a certain video project 6 months ago, along with elimination of all witnesses to related financial arrangements. Rob kept his expression neutral. Trevor Kane's operation was thoroughly dismantled. There's nothing left to clean up. Except you, Mr. Mitchell, and your son, and the unfortunately persistent Ms. Linda Mitchell, who's been asking inconvenient questions about money transfers and offshore accounts. The pieces finally clicked into place. Linda hadn't been randomly testing boundaries with her messages to Danny. She'd been investigating the financial trail from Trevor's operation, trying to understand where the money had really come from and where it had gone. She found something, Rob said. She found enough to be dangerous. Names, account numbers, transaction records. Information that could expose operations much larger than Trevor Kane's amateur schemes. So you're cleaning house. We're protecting investments. Mr. Mitchell, your reputation for intelligence is well-deserved. Surely you understand that some secrets are worth killing for. Rob did understand, but understanding didn't mean accepting. These people had made a fundamental error in judgment. They'd assumed Robert Mitchell would negotiate when cornered, just as Trevor Kane had assumed 6 months earlier. Here's what's going to happen, Rob said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded construction crews and boardrooms for decades. You're going to release Linda. You're going to leave my son alone, and you're going to disappear from our lives permanently. The lead man smiled. And if we refuse, then you're going to learn why smart people don't threaten Robert Mitchell. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. Rob moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to fight before he'd learned to negotiate, using tools and techniques that had been honed in environments far more dangerous than corporate boardrooms. The first man went down with a nail gun to the chest, a construction tool repurposed for close-quarters combat. The second fell to a framing hammer applied with surgical precision. The third managed to draw his weapon before Rob's crowbar opened his skull like an overripe fruit. Professional killers, Rob had learned, were often unprepared for legitimate violence from unexpected sources. They planned for resistance from other professionals, not from successful businessmen who remembered how to kill with their hands. Rob's phone rang as he stood among the bodies. Pete Romano's voice was tense with urgency. Rob, we found the warehouse. Linda's alive, but barely. These people were planning to eliminate everyone connected to the Kane operation. How many others are there? Unknown. But Rob, we found financial records. This goes deeper than Trevor Kane. Someone's been using small-time cons to test larger operations, identifying targets for much bigger schemes. Rob processed this information while surveying his destroyed living room. The attack on his family hadn't been personal. It had been professional. A test run for operations targeting other wealthy families, other successful businessmen. Pete, I need you to listen carefully. There are 3 bodies in my house. Professional killers, armed and dangerous. They came here to kill me and my son, and they had Linda as leverage. Jesus, Rob. Are you? I'm fine. Danny's safe. But this isn't over. Someone sent these people, someone with resources and connections. We need to find them before they send more. Rob ended the call and looked around his destroyed home. The house where he'd built a life, raised a son, trusted a wife who'd betrayed him. It was just property now, another asset to be protected or abandoned as circumstances demanded. What mattered was Danny's safety and the absolute certainty that no one would ever threaten his family again. Robert Mitchell had learned something important about himself during this crisis. He was capable of anything necessary to protect what he loved. And anyone foolish enough to test that capability would discover, as Trevor Kane and these professional killers had discovered, that the price of threatening Robert Mitchell was always paid in full. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 2 years after the warehouse confrontation, Robert Mitchell stood in his new office overlooking the harbor, watching construction crews put finishing touches on the Mitchell security complex. What had begun as a personal defense measure had evolved into a comprehensive security consulting firm, serving wealthy families and successful businesses throughout the region. The events that destroyed his marriage and tested his family had transformed Rob from a traditional contractor into something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous to those who might threaten what he protected. Mitchell and Sons still operated, still built quality structures throughout the tri-state area. But Mitchell Security was where Rob's true attention focused now, preventing other families from experiencing the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed his own. "Dad, the Portland team just checked in," Danny announced, entering the office with a tablet full of updates. At 18, Danny had grown into his father's analytical nature while maintaining the moral clarity that had emerged from his mother's betrayal. He would start college in the fall, but had spent his gap year learning the family businesses from the ground up. Any issues with the Kane surveillance? None. He's maintained the same routine for 23 months. Work, apartment, grocery store. No contact with criminal associates. No unusual financial activity. Either he's genuinely reformed or he's extremely careful. Rob suspected the latter. Men like Trevor Kane didn't reform. They adapted, evolved, learned from their mistakes. Keeping him under observation wasn't about punishment. It was about early warning. If Trevor ever decided to return to his old profession, Rob intended to know about it immediately. What about Linda? Danny's expression hardened slightly. Same as always. The condo downtown, part-time job at the art gallery, limited social circle. She's been asking around about you again, trying to get information from your old business associates. Linda had never stopped probing for weaknesses, never stopped looking for angles. The financial settlement from their divorce had been generous but finite, and Rob suspected she was calculating whether another approach might yield better results. She learned nothing from Trevor's failure, except to be more careful about her methods. Any direct contact attempts? 3 messages this week. I deleted them without reading. Danny's relationship with his mother had remained severed since that night in the garage. Rob had offered counseling, encouraged reconciliation, even arranged supervised visits during the legal proceedings. But Danny's decision had been absolute and unwavering. Linda Mitchell had forfeited her right to be his mother when she chose betrayal over family. Rob worried about the emotional cost of such complete rejection, but he also respected his son's moral consistency. Danny had learned the hardest lesson anyone could learn, that trust, once broken completely, could never be rebuilt. The Harrison contract is ready for your signature, Danny continued, setting the tablet aside. Full estate security for the next 5 years. They specifically requested you personally after what happened to the Andersons. The Anderson case had been Rob's most high-profile success, preventing a kidnapping attempt against the tech mogul's family by identifying the threat weeks before it materialized. The methods Mitchell Security employed were unconventional, often legally questionable, but absolutely effective. Any word from Pete about the federal investigation? Still ongoing. The people behind the warehouse operation had connections in 12 states, operations targeting at least 30 families. The FBI thinks they were building towards something much larger. Rob had provided extensive cooperation with federal investigators, sharing everything he'd learned about the conspiracy that had targeted his family. But he'd also maintained private channels of information, ensuring that Mitchell's security stayed ahead of any threats that official law enforcement might miss. The war that had begun with Trevor Kane's amateur extortion scheme had revealed a much larger criminal enterprise. Professional operations targeting successful families, exploiting personal vulnerabilities to steal wealth and destroy lives. Rob's successful defense of his own family had made him a valuable ally to law enforcement and a sought-after protector for other potential targets. "Danny, there's something we need to discuss." His son looked up from the tablet, instantly alert. Over the past 2 years, they developed a communication style based on absolute honesty and mutual respect. No secrets, no protected feelings, no assumptions that problems would resolve themselves without direct action. "It's about your mother." Danny's expression didn't change, but Rob noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "What about her?" "She's dying." The words hung in the air between them. Rob had received the medical information from Linda's doctor 3 days earlier. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage, prognosis measured in months rather than years. "How long?" Danny asked, his voice professionally calm. 6 months, maybe less. Danny nodded, processing the information with the same analytical detachment he brought to security assessments and business analysis. "Does she know you know?" "Yes. She asked me to tell you. Asked if you might consider visiting her." "And what did you tell her?" "That the decision was yours to make." Danny was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the harbor where fishing boats were returning with their morning catch. Rob waited, knowing that his son needed time to work through the emotional complexities of the situation. "She made her choice," Danny said finally. "When she chose Trevor over us, when she decided to destroy our family for money, she ended any claim to my concern or my presence. Even knowing she's dying, especially knowing she's dying, this is her last chance to manipulate me, to use guilt and sympathy to get the emotional connection she forfeited through her actions." Rob felt a chill at his son's cold analysis, even as he admired the logical consistency. Danny had learned from his mother's betrayal, but perhaps he'd learned too well. "Danny, mercy isn't weakness. Compassion doesn't require trust. You can acknowledge her suffering without forgiving her betrayal. Can I? Or would visiting her send the message that betrayal can be overcome with enough time and the right circumstances?" It was a fair question, one that Rob had been wrestling with since receiving Linda's diagnosis. The moral framework they'd built together emphasized consequences, accountability, the permanent nature of certain choices. But it also risked creating people who were incapable of forgiveness, mercy, or growth. "What do you think I should do?" Danny asked. Rob considered his answer carefully. His son was 18 now, legally an adult, intellectually mature beyond his years. But he was also carrying wounds that might never fully heal, shaped by lessons that were both necessary and potentially limiting. "I think you should remember that showing mercy to someone who's dying doesn't excuse their betrayal of you when they were living. You can be kind without being weak, compassionate without being foolish." Danny nodded slowly. "And if I choose not to see her, then that's your choice to make, and I'll support it completely. What about you? Will you see her?" Rob thought about Linda, the beautiful young waitress he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd shared his dreams and helped him build a life, the wife who'd ultimately chosen to destroy everything they'd created together. "Yes," he said finally. "Not to forgive her, not to rebuild anything, but to close the circle. To end this chapter of our lives with clarity rather than unfinished business." Danny returned to his tablet, but Rob could see he was struggling with the decision. The boy had built his emotional defenses around absolute principles, but real life rarely offered absolute situations. "Take your time," Rob said. "Whatever you decide, we'll handle it together." That evening, Rob drove to Linda's condo for the first time since their divorce was finalized. She answered the door looking frail but still recognizable. The woman he'd shared 18 years with, now facing the consequences of choices that had seemed so important 2 years ago. "Rob, thank you for coming." They sat in her living room, surrounded by furniture he'd paid for, artwork they'd selected together, photographs of a family that no longer existed. The conversation was awkward, stilted, weighted with history that couldn't be undone. "I know you hate me," Linda said finally. "I don't hate you," Rob replied honestly. "Hate requires emotional investment. You're simply someone I used to know who made choices I can't respect." Linda flinched at the cold assessment, but nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. "Will Danny come see me?" "I don't know. That's his decision to make. He's become just like you, hasn't he? Hard, unforgiving, incapable of mercy." Rob studied the woman who'd once been his wife, seeing the manipulation even in her dying moments. He's become someone who understands that actions have consequences. That trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt with words and time. And you think that's healthy? That emotional isolation? I think it's realistic. You taught him that the people closest to him could be the most dangerous. That's a lesson that will serve him well. Linda began to cry, quiet tears that might have moved him once, before he'd learned the cost of misplaced trust. "I made a mistake, Rob. A terrible mistake. But I loved you both in my way." "No," Rob said firmly. "You loved what we could provide for you. Security, status, comfort. When you thought you could get those things more easily through betrayal than through loyalty, you chose betrayal. People change, Rob. People can learn from their mistakes, grow beyond their failures. Some people can. You had 2 years to prove you'd changed, to demonstrate growth or remorse or accountability. Instead, you've spent that time probing for new angles, testing boundaries, looking for ways to reinsert yourself into our lives." Linda's tears stopped as she processed the accusation. "You've been watching me." "Of course I have. You proved you can't be trusted, so trust became irrelevant. Verification became essential. And you'll watch me until I die? Until you die, or until you prove you're no longer a threat to my son's emotional well-being." Linda nodded slowly, finally understanding that this conversation wasn't about reconciliation or forgiveness. It was about establishing final parameters, closing accounts, ensuring that her death wouldn't create new complications for the family she'd abandoned. "Tell Danny," she said as Rob prepared to leave. "Tell him I'm sorry. Not for the consequences, not for getting caught, but for the choice itself. For choosing someone else over the family I was supposed to protect." Rob looked back at her from the doorway. "I'll tell him. Whether he believes it or cares about it is up to him." Linda Mitchell died 6 weeks later, alone in a hospice room, surrounded by flowers from people who'd known her briefly rather than deeply. Danny didn't attend the funeral, though he sent a single white rose with no note attached. Standing at her graveside, Rob felt neither satisfaction nor regret. Linda's death was simply the end of a chapter that had concluded long before her diagnosis. The woman he'd loved had died the night she chose Trevor Kane over her family. What had passed away in the hospice was simply the physical remainder of someone who'd become a stranger through her own choices. "No regrets?" Pete Romano asked, standing beside his oldest friend as other mourners dispersed. "None," Rob replied. "She made her choices. We all live and die with the consequences of our decisions." "And Danny?" Rob looked toward his son, who was waiting by the car, strong and self-possessed, and utterly unmoved by the ceremony they'd just witnessed. Danny learned the most important lesson anyone can learn: that trust must be earned and that betrayal has permanent consequences. That's a hard way to